The first time my parents walked into my office after 10 years of silence, they didn't recognize me. Not at first. They didn't recognize the company logo on the glass walls. They didn't recognize the assistants rushing through the marble lobby. And they definitely didn't recognize the man sitting behind the massive black walnut desk on the 38th floor. But the moment my mother realized whose office she had just stormed into, her face turned completely white, and my father, the same man who once threw my clothes onto the front lawn and told me I would never survive in the real world, suddenly couldn't look me in the eyes. Because the desperate business meeting they had spent 3 weeks begging to secure was with the son they threw out at 16, and the reason they were begging for that meeting, because without my signature, their entire company would collapse within 30 days. But to understand how my parents ended up standing in my office 10 years later, asking the child they abandoned to save them, you need to understand something about my family. In our house growing up, there were only 2 kinds of people, the golden child and the disappointment. My older brother Daniel had always been the golden one. Perfect grades, perfect smile, perfect future. He played varsity baseball, student council president, full scholarship to a prestigious private university. My parents used to talk about him like he was some kind of investment portfolio that had finally started paying dividends. Meanwhile, there was me, the accident. At least that's what my father called me once when he thought I couldn't hear. I wasn't stupid, I wasn't lazy, I just wasn't Daniel. And in my parents' eyes, that meant I was already failing. But the moment everything truly fell apart happened on a cold Tuesday night when I was 16 years old, and the reason it happened was $20. It was late when I got home from my part-time job washing dishes at a small diner 2 blocks from our house. My backpack still smelled like fryer grease, and my hands were cracked from scrubbing metal trays for 5 hours straight. I had started working there to save money for community college, because unlike Daniel, nobody was paying for my future. When I walked into the kitchen, my father was already waiting, sitting at the table, arms crossed, a $20 bill sitting in front of him like evidence in a courtroom. "Want to explain this?" he asked. I blinked. What? My mother stood by the sink, shaking her head like she was already disappointed in whatever answer I was about to give. "That money disappeared from your brother's wallet," my father said slowly, "and guess who was the only person home?" My stomach dropped. I didn't take it. Daniel leaned casually against the counter, watching the whole thing like it was a movie he'd already seen before. "Really?" he said, "because it was there this morning." I looked at my parents. "You believe him?" My father didn't even hesitate. Of course I believe him. That was the moment I realized something terrifying. The trial had already ended, the verdict had already been decided, and I had already lost. "I didn't steal anything," I said again, but my father suddenly stood up so fast his chair slammed against the wall. "Stop lying to me." "I'm not." "You're 16 years old," he snapped. "You barely pass your classes, you work a dead-end job, and now you're stealing from your own family?" My chest tightened. I said I didn't take it. My father walked to the front door, opened it, and then he said 4 words that would change the rest of my life. "Then get out." At first, I thought he was bluffing, but then he grabbed my backpack from the floor and threw it onto the porch. "Take your things and go," he said coldly. "Maybe the real world will teach you the lesson we clearly couldn't." My mother didn't stop him. Daniel didn't stop him. Nobody did. Within 5 minutes, I was standing outside my own house with nothing but a backpack and $73 in my pocket. And as the porch light shut off behind me, I realized something else. I wasn't just being punished, I was being erased. But what my parents didn't know that night was getting kicked out at 16 would become the single most expensive mistake they would ever make, because 10 years later, they would walk into my office believing they were meeting the only investor who could save their collapsing business, and they would discover something that would terrify them. The son they abandoned now owned the company that controlled their future. For the first few minutes after my father slammed that door behind me, I just stood there, 16 years old, middle of November, no jacket, no plan, and nowhere to go. The streetlights buzzed quietly above the empty neighborhood, casting long yellow shadows across the pavement. Every house looked the same, warm lights in the windows, families inside eating dinner, except mine. Mine had just thrown me away over $20. At first I thought they would cool down, that maybe after a few hours my mother would open the door and call me back inside. So I waited, 30 minutes, then an hour, then 2. The porch light never turned back on. Around midnight, the cold finally forced me to move. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip my backpack, and that was the moment the real world introduced itself. Not with kindness, not with opportunity, but with silence. I walked for nearly an hour before reaching the diner where I worked. The neon "Open 24 hours" sign buzzed faintly in the window. Inside, the same tired waitress who worked the night shift, Linda, was wiping down the counter. She looked up when the bell above the door rang and immediately noticed something was wrong. "You okay, kid?" she asked. I tried to say yes. Instead, my voice cracked, and that was all it took. Within 15 minutes, Linda had a hot plate of fries in front of me and a cup of coffee I technically wasn't old enough to drink. She didn't ask too many questions. She didn't push. But after listening quietly for a few minutes, she sighed. "You can sleep in the back booth tonight." That night turned into 2 nights. 2 nights turned into a week, and eventually the diner became the closest thing I had to a home. But something strange happened during those long overnight shifts scrubbing dishes and wiping tables. Something that changed everything. For the first time in my life, no one expected me to fail. No one compared me to Daniel. No one reminded me that I wasn't good enough. And once that pressure disappeared, something inside me woke up. I started reading business books during my breaks, anything I could find, old paperbacks customers left behind, library books, even ripped magazines about entrepreneurship and startups. At first it was just curiosity, but then something clicked. The stories were always the same. People who had nothing, people nobody believed in, people who got underestimated and then built something powerful enough that the world had no choice but to notice. And one night, sometime around 3:40 in the morning while cleaning syrup off a booth, a thought hit me so hard I actually stopped moving. What if my parents were wrong? Not about the $20, about everything. That idea became an obsession. Within a year, I had saved nearly every dollar I made at the diner. By 18, I had a tiny studio apartment. By 19, I had enrolled in night classes for business and finance. But the real turning point came during a random conversation with a customer who walked into the diner at 2 in the morning. He ordered black coffee, sat quietly for almost an hour, and then asked me a question that would completely alter the trajectory of my life. "You ever thought about investing?" I laughed. "With what money?" He shrugged. "Doesn't take much to start." That man turned out to be a retired financial analyst, and over the next 6 months, he taught me everything: stocks, market psychology, risk management, opportunity. But the most important thing he taught me wasn't about money, it was about patterns. "Most people chase stability," he told me once, "but the real fortunes get built when things start falling apart." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant, but 10 years later, I would. Because while I was quietly building a life from nothing, my family was building something too, a construction company. My father and Daniel had started it together shortly after I was kicked out, and for a while, it actually worked. Local contracts, steady growth, new trucks, new house, everything my parents ever wanted. They became the success story of the neighborhood, and for years, they believed that success proved something, that they had backed the right child, that they had made the right decision. But what they didn't understand was that the exact industry they had built their fortune on was the same industry I was quietly learning how to control. And by the time they realized what was happening, it was already too late. Because 10 years after being thrown out of that house, I didn't just have a job, I didn't just have money, I had something far more dangerous: control. And the first time my father learned that truth was the moment he walked into the office of the investment firm that now owned the bank loan keeping his entire company alive. What he didn't know was that the person behind that firm was the same 16-year-old boy he once threw onto the street. By the time my father and Daniel realized their company was in trouble, the damage had already spread too far to stop. Construction is a strange industry. When the economy is strong, money flows like water. Projects everywhere, new buildings, new developments. But when the economy shifts, even slightly, everything starts collapsing in slow motion. Contracts get delayed, investors pull out, banks tighten lending, and companies that once looked successful suddenly discovered they were standing on very thin ice. That's exactly what happened to my father's company. At first, it was small things, a delayed payment from a commercial developer, a materials supplier suddenly demanding faster payment terms. Then, a major project in Newark got suspended halfway through construction, millions of dollars locked in unfinished steel and concrete. Within 6 months, their cash flow collapsed. Payroll became a struggle, equipment loans piled up, and the bank that had financed most of their expansion started asking uncomfortable questions. That bank loan was the only thing keeping their company alive. 32 employees, 5 active job sites, millions in equipment leases, all balanced on one fragile agreement with a lender that suddenly wasn't feeling very patient anymore. What my father didn't know was that 6 months earlier, that bank had quietly sold the debt to a private investment firm, a firm that specialized in distressed companies, a firm known for buying failing businesses and restructuring them from the inside, a firm whose headquarters happened to occupy the 38th floor of a glass tower downtown, my office. But none of that was obvious to my parents when they first requested the meeting. All they knew was that their bank had told them something terrifying. Your loan has been transferred. If you want to renegotiate terms, you'll need to speak with the new controlling investor. So they did what desperate people always do. They started begging for a meeting. Emails, phone calls, voicemails, 3 full weeks of pleading with my assistant. I watched every message come in, and every time my assistant asked if she should schedule the appointment, I said the same thing. Not yet. Because timing matters, especially when someone has spent 10 years believing you're worthless. Finally, on a quiet Thursday morning, I told her to book them. 10:30 a.m., Conference Room B. I didn't even tell her who they were. At 10:28, my assistant buzzed my office. They're here. My stomach tightened. 10 years. 10 years since the night I stood outside that house with $73 and nowhere to go. Now the same people were sitting 20 feet away, hoping I might save them. I walked to the conference room slowly, not because I was nervous, because I wanted to see their faces. The glass door was slightly open. Inside, my father and Daniel sat across from each other at the long, polished table. They both looked older, more tired. The confidence I remembered from my childhood had faded into something closer to worry. Stacks of paperwork covered the table. Financial statements, loan agreements, desperate plans. My father cleared his throat. "Do we know when this investor is coming?" Daniel shrugged. "No idea, but whoever they are, we need them." He leaned back in the chair. "If they call the loan, we're finished." My father rubbed his temples. "They won't. No investor wants a company to collapse. They'll restructure it." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah, we just need them to give us time." That's when I pushed the door open. Both of them looked up immediately. At first, they just saw another executive in a suit, another corporate stranger. My father stood politely. "Good morning," he said. I walked into the room, closed the door behind me, and took the seat at the head of the table. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Daniel frowned slightly. "Sorry," he said, "we're waiting for the investor." I folded my hands calmly on the table. "You're looking at him." Silence. My father blinked. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Confusion filled the room like smoke. And then my father leaned forward, studying my face more closely. The recognition hit him slowly. First confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked very close to fear. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "Ryan?" For a long moment, nobody moved. The air inside the conference room felt heavy, like the oxygen had suddenly been replaced with something thicker. My father kept staring at me, not the way someone looks at a business executive, the way someone looks at a ghost. "Ryan?" he repeated. Daniel turned slowly in his chair, looking between us. "What?" My father didn't answer him. He couldn't, because the realization was spreading across his face like a slow crack in glass. Daniel leaned forward, studying me more carefully, and then I watched the exact moment it hit him, too. The same dark hair, the same jawline, the same eyes, just older now, sharper, more controlled. "No," Daniel muttered under his breath. I sat calmly at the head of the table. "You asked for a meeting," I said evenly. Daniel laughed once, a short, nervous sound. "Okay, what is this?" My father still hadn't taken his eyes off me. His voice trembled slightly. You work here?" "I own it." That was the moment the room truly went silent. Not the awkward silence of strangers, the kind of silence that appears when reality suddenly shifts in a way nobody expected. Daniel blinked. "That's not funny." I slid a folder across the table. "Your company's loan agreement," I said. "Originally issued by First Metropolitan Bank, transferred 6 months ago." Daniel opened the folder quickly, scanning the first page. His face drained of color, because at the top of the document, printed clearly in bold letters, was the name of the firm that now controlled every dollar they owed. My firm. My father leaned forward slowly. "You're telling me," he began carefully, "that you're the one who bought our loan?" "I didn't buy it personally. My company did." Daniel slammed the folder shut. "This is insane." "Is it?" My father swallowed. "You're serious?" I leaned back slightly in the chair. "As of right now," I said calmly, "your company owes my firm $3.2 million. Neither of them spoke. Daniel stared at the table. My father looked like he had just stepped into a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. And then Daniel asked the question that had clearly been building in his head since the moment he recognized me. "How?" Just one word, but it carried 10 years of disbelief inside it. "How did you do this?" I considered answering honestly, explaining the diner, the night classes, the investing, the years of sleeping 4 hours a night, building something from nothing. But in the end, I decided they didn't need the whole story, so I gave them the short version. I worked. Daniel scoffed. "You expect us to believe you built a multi-million-dollar investment firm?" I looked at him calmly. "You expected me to survive on the street at 16. That shut him up. My father finally sat down again, slowly, like his legs had stopped trusting him. "This is unbelievable," he said quietly. But then something interesting happened. The shock on his face began to fade, and in its place, something else appeared. Hope. Because suddenly my father leaned forward, and his voice changed. "Ryan," he said carefully, "this might actually be a good thing." Daniel nodded quickly. "Yes, exactly." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" My father gestured toward the folder. "You control the loan now." "That's correct. So you can help us." There it was. Not an apology, not regret, not even acknowledgement of what they had done, just opportunity. My father continued talking, his confidence growing. "We're still a strong company," he said. "We just need time. If you restructure the loan terms—" Daniel leaned in. 6 months, he added quickly. "That's all we need." I listened quietly, watching them, studying them, and the strangest thing about the moment was that neither of them seemed embarrassed, neither of them seemed ashamed. They were simply negotiating, with the son they had once thrown out like garbage. My father finally finished speaking. "So, what do you say?" he asked carefully, and for the first time since entering the room, I smiled, not kindly, not warmly, but slowly, because they still didn't understand something. They thought they were asking for help. What they didn't realize was that they were asking for mercy. For a few seconds after my father finished speaking, nobody said anything. Daniel sat forward in his chair, elbows on the table, watching me carefully. My father had that same hopeful look people get when they believe a problem is about to disappear. They truly believed this was going to end well for them. That somehow the universe had handed them a miracle, their abandoned son, now powerful enough to save them. But they had forgotten something important about miracles. They don't happen for free. I slowly closed the loan folder in front of me. "You want 6 months," I said. My father nodded immediately. "That's right." Daniel leaned in eagerly. "Just enough time to finish the Newark project and stabilize cash flow. After that, we can refinance." I held up a hand. He stopped talking. "Let's be clear about something," I said calmly. Both of them looked at me. "You're not asking for time," I continued. "You're asking me not to destroy your company." The words hung in the air. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. My father forced a tight smile. "That's a dramatic way of putting it." "Is it?" I slid another document across the table. "According to your loan agreement," I said, "if your company fails to meet its payment obligations for 90 consecutive days, the lender gains the legal right to seize company assets." Daniel opened the document. His face darkened as he read. Equipment, vehicles, property, everything. My father cleared his throat. "We're aware of the clause." "Good." I folded my hands. "Because you've already missed 87 days. That number hit the room like a hammer. Daniel's head snapped up. "What?" My father turned to him sharply. "Is that true?" Daniel looked uncomfortable. We delayed the last payment." "Delayed?" I said quietly. "You defaulted." My father's shoulders sagged slightly. For the first time since the meeting started, real fear appeared in his eyes. "So what happens in 3 days?" he asked. I answered calmly. "My firm gains full legal control of your assets." Daniel slammed his hand on the table. "You're not going to do that." I looked at him. "Why not?" "Because we're family." The word felt strange coming from him. Family, a word that hadn't existed for me in 10 years. My father leaned forward again. "Ryan, we made mistakes." I raised an eyebrow. "Mistakes?" His voice softened. "You were young. We were trying to teach responsibility." I almost laughed. Responsibility. That was the word he chose for abandoning a 16-year-old kid in the cold. Daniel jumped in quickly. "Look, we don't need to revisit the past," he said. "We just need to figure out a solution." I nodded slowly. "That's exactly what we're doing." Daniel leaned forward. "So what do you want?" Now we were getting somewhere. I stood up and walked toward the glass wall overlooking the city, 38 floors above the streets, thousands of people moving below. 10 years earlier, I had been sleeping on a diner booth. Funny how life works. When I turned back around, both of them were watching me carefully, waiting. I returned to the table, sat down, and slid one final document toward them. Daniel grabbed it first. His eyes scanned the page, then widened. "What the hell is this?" My father leaned closer, and the moment he read the title, his face went pale, because at the top of the document were 3 words, Acquisition Agreement. Daniel looked up. "You want to buy our company?" "Correct." My father stared at me. "For how much?" I folded my hands. $0. The room exploded. "You're insane," Daniel snapped. "You can't just take our company." "I'm not taking it," I said calmly. "You're giving it to me." My father's voice trembled. "That's theft." "No," I replied. "That's business." Daniel pushed the document back across the table. "We're not signing that." I nodded slowly. "That's your choice." Then I glanced at the clock on the wall. 10:52 a.m. "Just keep one thing in mind," I added quietly. "In 72 hours, the bank clause activates." My father's voice cracked. "And then what?" I met his eyes. "Then I take it anyway." The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time in the entire meeting, my parents finally understood something. They weren't negotiating anymore. They were cornered, and the son they once threw out into the street now owned the ground beneath their feet.